Here you learn young that the ice which takes a man is never the ice that looks dangerous. The black, groaning stuff out past the point, the open leads where the current runs, those you stay off without being told twice. It's the white, friendly-looking sheet near the shore, the patch everybody's been walking across all week that drops you through into water cold enough to stop your heart in 90 seconds. My father taught me that on Lake Superior when I was 9, and somehow I spent the next 58 years applying it to ice and nothing else. I want to ask you something before I tell you what happened in my own house this past winter, and I'd like you to actually sit with it instead of brushing it off the way I would have a year ago. When the thing that's coming for you arrives wearing a familiar face, carrying a present, saying your name the way it's been said at your supper table for years, would you know? Because I didn't, and I'd have told anybody who asked that I was about the hardest fellow in Thunder Bay to put one over on. My name is Lloyd. I'm 67, and I've lived in the same house off River Street my whole married life. A square little 2-story that I bought in 1981 when the mill was still hiring, and a man could pay off a mortgage on one income if he didn't drink it. I worked 34 years as a millwright at the paper mill out on the river, keeping the big machines running through every kind of breakdown you can imagine, and a few you can't. My hands don't close all the way anymore. That's the job leaving its signature. My wife Helen passed 3 winters ago. Pancreatic. They found it in October and we buried her in February, and I've never in my life been so grateful and so furious at how fast a thing can move. The house has been too quiet since. I keep the thermostat at 65 because heating an empty house warm feels like waste, and Helen would have had something to say about that. She ran cold her whole life. I still set the coffee maker for 2 cups out of habit and pour the second one down the sink. You'd think after 3 years that would stop. It hasn't. My pension is solid. A real one. The defined benefit kind they don't hand out anymore. And between that, my CPP, and the old age security, I'm comfortable. Not rich. Comfortable. The house is paid for. I've got a RIF at the credit union, and a couple of GICs Helen and I built up over the years for no reason except that her father had lived through the 30s and she could never quite believe money would still be there if she didn't lock it down. I worked for every dollar of it, most of it in steel-toed boots at 3 in the morning. I mention all this not to brag because there's nothing to brag about, but because you need to understand what was on the table. You need to understand what a paid-off house in a good neighborhood and a decent pension look like to the wrong set of eyes. I have one son, Brian. He's 38, and he's a good man. I want that said plainly and up front, because some of what comes next isn't kind, and none of it is his fault. Brian works 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off at a mine up near Red Lake, a fly-in, fly-out rotation that pays well and takes a piece out of you. When he's home, he's home. He's home. He's gone half his life, and that matters to the story. His wife is Shauna. They've been married 11 years, and they've got my 2 grandkids, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6, who still call me Grandpa Lloyd like it's all one word. Sean is a mortgage broker, sharp, organized, the kind of person who answers an email at 10 at night and remembers your appointments better than you do. After Helen died, Shauna was the one who showed up. Brian was grieving his mother from a mining camp 400 kilometers north, calling when he could, and Shauna filled the gap. She brought casseroles. She sorted Helen's clothes when I couldn't make myself open the closet. She sat with me. I'd be lying if I said I didn't lean on her. A man alone leans on whoever holds out an arm, and she held out both. So when she started about a year ago, offering to help with my paperwork, it felt like more of the same. My taxes, my bills, the credit union statements I let pile up on the dining table. She said, "Lloyd, let me just get this organized for you. You've got better things to do than chase paper." She set up a banker's box in the spare room, the room that used to be Brian's, and she'd come by every couple of weeks and file things. I gave her the run of it. Why wouldn't I? She was family, and she was helping, and I genuinely did have better things to do than chase paper, even if those better things amounted to watching the river freeze and not much else. The slip on the ice is what changed the temperature of everything, though I didn't know it then. Last December, I went down hard on my own front steps taking out the recycling. Caught my heel on a patch I should have salted, and cracked my hip, not broken, just cracked. But at my age, that's 2 weeks of barely moving and a real scare. Shauna drove me to the appointments, and it was right after that, the week before Christmas, that she came by with a present. Early, she said, because Brian was up at the mine and wouldn't be home till the 20th event, and she wanted me to have it for the holidays. It was a home monitoring system, a nice one by the look of the box, 2 little indoor cameras, a hub that plugged into the wall, a voice speaker, and a wearable pendant with a button on it. The whole thing marketed at exactly people like me, old men living alone who've just fallen down. Shauna had it half set up before she finished explaining it. The pendant was so I could call for help if I went down again and couldn't reach a phone. The cameras were so she and Brian could look in and know I was all right. The speaker could phone any of us hands-free. She did the whole installation off her own phone, mounted 1 camera in the kitchen and 1 in the front hall, found the outlet for the hub, paired the pendant. 45 minutes, maybe less. She kept up a warm patter the whole time about how Brian would sleep better up north, knowing somebody had eyes on me. She kissed my cheek on the way out and told me to wear the pendant in the shower. That's when people fall. Then she was gone, and I stood in my front hall looking at a little blinking green light I'd never had there before, and I felt looked after. That's the word, looked after. I used it exactly the way she showed me. For 3 weeks I thought it was one of the more thoughtful things anybody had ever done for me. It was Earl who turned the light a different color. Earl and I go back to grade school in Fort William before they amalgamated it into Thunder Bay. And we've had coffee most Tuesday mornings for the better part of 40 years at a diner on Memorial that serves coffee you could patch a roof with and home fries worth driving across town for. Earl did 6 years in the Forces and Signals before he came home and spent his whole career as a lineman and then a technician for the phone company. There is not a wire, a board, or a radio in this country he doesn't understand. He's 68 now and a little slower up the stairs, but his mind is a bear trap with the springs still good. I was showing off the system, honestly. Pulled out my phone at the diner to show him I could see my own kitchen from across the city. Earl looked at it the way you'd look at a dog that's growling and nothing. He asked me what brand. He asked me hut-tayest. Me hut set it up. I told him Shauna had off her phone and that she could check in anytime, which I thought was the whole point. He asked me, did she keep the administrator on her end? I said I suppose so. I didn't really know what that meant. He put his fork down. He didn't pick it up again. He asked me to describe the hub, the box plugged into the wall, and I did, and his face changed. Not a lot. Earl's not a man who gives much away. But I'd known that face since we were 9 years old, and it was the face he wore the morning he told me his brother had drowned. He said, Lloyd, I'd like to come have a look at that thing. Today, if you've got time. I laughed at him. Told him he was being an old spook seeing enemies in a wall outlet. He didn't laugh back, and Earl always laughs back. That was the moment, if I'm honest, that the cold first went down my neck. He had the hub open on my kitchen table, inside 20 minutes of walking in the door. He carries a little roll of tools in his coat pocket the way other men carry mints. He turned the board over under my reading lamp, took a couple of photos with his phone, and then he sat back and breathed out slow through his nose, and I knew before he said a word that I wasn't going to like it. He said this wasn't the way it came from the factory. He pointed to a little piece soldered onto the board, off to one side, and told me that wasn't a part the manufacturer put there. He said it extended the microphone range across the whole main floor. So the thing wasn't just listening when somebody pushed a button or when a camera cut motion. It was listening all the time, every word, every room within range. Then he pointed to something else and told me the unit had a second way out. It wasn't only sending video to the app the way Shauna had shown me. There was another path sending audio somewhere else, to some account that wasn't the one on my phone. He said he couldn't tell me sitting at my table with a pocket kid exactly where that audio was landing, but he could tell me that somebody had taken a perfectly ordinary store-bought unit and gone to real trouble, careful, skilled trouble, to make it into something that watched me and made it look like a Christmas present while it did. I sat down. I remember the chair felt strange under me, like furniture in somebody else's house. I said out loud, mostly to myself, Shauna installed it. And Earl nodded, slow, and he didn't look one bit surprised, and that was almost worse than the thing on the board. I drove home from Earl's that night with the hub and a Canadian Tire bag on the passenger seat, and the city looked exactly the way it always looks in January. Salt white and orange under the streetlights, the snowbanks taller than the cars. Same roads I've driven 10,000 times, but it all sat at a wrong angle. The way your own kitchen looks unfamiliar when you had a fever and you come downstairs after 2 days in bed. I kept both hands on the wheel and I did not cry, and I did not call anybody. And the hardest thing in the whole world that night was the thing I made myself do, which was nothing. Shauna phoned around 8 to ask how I was feeling and whether I'd remembered my blood thinner. And I talked to her for 15 minutes about the grandkids and the weather, and the plow that kept burying the end of my driveway, and my voice did not shake. I don't know how. I think a man who spent his life keeping broken machines running learns to keep his own face running too. The next morning I went down to the Thunder Bay Police on Balmoral, on my own steam, the hub in the same bag. The young constable at the desk looked at me with that gentle, slightly impatient kindness the young have for old men they assume are confused. I asked for somebody in the criminal investigation side, and I waited. And eventually I got a detective sergeant named Becker. She was maybe 45, plain-spoken, the kind who writes things down on a yellow pad instead of a screen. She didn't interrupt me. She didn't look at me like I was a foolish old fellow inventing a drama to fill his empty days, which was the look I'd been braced for. She took the hub. She looked at Earl's photos, which I'd had him send me. She didn't promise me a single thing, but she also didn't dismiss me, and at my age you learn that's worth more than a promise. She phoned 2 days later. The technical people had confirmed what Earl said. The unit was modified to capture audio continuously and route it to a cloud account that was not registered to me. Somebody, she said, had been receiving a live feed of the sound inside my home. I had pulled over into the lot at the Safeway on Arthur to take the call, and I sat there with the engine running and the heater roaring, and I felt very far away from myself. Then Detective Becker asked me, careful and direct, whether I knew of any reason somebody might want to listen to my daily routine. My phone calls. Whether there was anything going on with my money, my health, my legal affairs. I said no, but the word came out hollow, and I think she heard the hollow in it before I did. She told me not to take the device out, not to change a single thing about how I lived. She said, and these were close to her exact words, she said to carry on as if I had no idea. I sat in that grocery store parking lot and understood that I had just been handed the loneliest instruction of my life. To go home and live inside a house that was listening to me and to pretend I didn't know it was, in front of the very people I'd have run to with any other trouble. I went home and I stood in the front hall and looked at the blinking green light, and I said to the empty house that I'd call Earl in the morning. And then I went to bed, and I lay there a long time listening to the furnace tick and wondering exactly how long that little light had been watching the back of my head while I slept. The next part I found by accident, the way you find most of the things that change your life. 2 days after Becker's call, Shauna phoned and asked very gently whether I'd been sleeping all right. She said she'd noticed on the camera that my kitchen light had been on at 3 in the morning a couple of nights running, and she was worried. She said it the way you'd say it to someone you were genuinely fretting over, the way she'd said things to me in the worst weeks after Helen. I told her I'd just been up reading, which was true, and my voice held, but inside I'd gone to ice, because now I knew for certain they were watching the picture too and reporting it back to me as concern. That same afternoon, I went into the spare room looking for a phone charger Brian had left there at Christmas, and I opened the banker's box Shauna kept her filing in. I wasn't snooping. I want that on the record even now. I was after a charger, but the box was fuller than it should have been for a man whose paperwork is mostly a pension stub and a hydro bill, and there was a manila folder near the front with my name on the tab in Shauna's handwriting. And something about my own name in somebody else's hand made me stop. I stood there a long while before I opened it. I want you to know I knew, before I lifted the cover, that I wasn't going to be the same man on the other side of it. Inside were printed documents in that official-looking type that makes your stomach drop before you've read a word. A continuing power of attorney for property, my name at the top, hers listed as attorney. A blank capacity assessment form. Information sheets about applying to have someone declared incapable of managing their own affairs, with the office's name on the letterhead, and under all of it, on a yellow legal pad, in Shauna's neat hand, a list of dates and observations. Lloyd, confused about pills, asked twice which day he takes the thinner. Lloyd drove to the old credit union branch on Court before remembering it closed. Lloyd talked about Helen at dinner as if she were still alive. I sat down on the edge of the bed that used to be my son's, and I read every page twice. That last note about Helen stopped my breath in my chest. Because I do talk about Helen. I talk about her the way you talk about a person you spent 31 years beside. Naturally, in the present tense sometimes, because 31 years doesn't get filed away neatly just because the death certificate says it's over. I hadn't been confused. I'd been a widower. There is an ocean of difference between those two things, and somebody had stood in my kitchen, eaten my food, and written the second one down as the first one on purpose. The last page was a property appraisal. My house, recently assessed, I'd never authorized any appraisal, at $348,000. And beside the number, in her hand, my pension amount, my RIF balance, the GICs, even the name of my insurer. Somebody had added me up, the whole sum of a working life, totaled in a column on a yellow pad, like inventory. I closed the folder. I put it back exactly where I'd found it, square in the box. I went to the kitchen and ran the cold tap over my wrists for a long time, which is a thing my mother used to do when news was bad, and I'd never understood it until that afternoon. Then I phoned Earl, and I told him all of it, and he listened the way he always does, without one interruption. When I finished, he asked me a single question. He asked whether Shauna had ever come right out and talked to me about the house, about what happened to it down the road, and I thought about it, and I told him no. Not directly, but there'd been a thing at Thanksgiving, light over the dishes, about how house prices had gone up even up here, and what a shame it was when an old person's place got sold off by strangers after they passed instead of staying in the family. I'd thought it was just talk. Earl was quiet a moment, and then he said, "This is a lot bigger than a wire on a board, Lloyd." He said, "Before you do anything else in this world, you get yourself a lawyer. And then you keep feeding that camera like you've never heard of me." That was the part I couldn't make peace with, even understanding why. Standing in my own front hall, in front of a thing I now hated, and performing, slowly, carefully, the role of an old man coming apart at the edges, giving them what they were already looking for. There was an ugliness to it I can't fully describe, like having to wear a costume cut from your own worst fear. But Earl was right, the way you're right about cold medicine. You don't take it because it's pleasant. I went to see Reg Tomlinson the next morning, before his office on Red River Road was even properly open. Reg handled Helen's estate, and he's done my will, and known me a dozen years. He put on his glasses and read the whole folder in silence, every page. And when he was done, he set it down and looked at me over the top of the frames. He said, "Lloyd, this is the early part of a guardianship. Somebody's building a case to be put in charge of you and everything you own." He said she hadn't filed anything yet, which meant I had time. But whoever helped her draft these knew exactly what they were doing. These weren't things you pull off the internet by accident. He told me 3 things, and they were the same 3 Becker had told me. Document everything. Change nothing. They can see. And whatever happens, however it's dressed up, do not sign one single piece of paper. So for the next stretch of weeks, I did a thing that turned my stomach every single morning. I fed them. Not sloppily. Not a performance anybody could later point to and call a performance. Just enough here and there to keep them rolling downhill the way they were already rolling. I'd say out loud in the kitchen with the pendant on that I'd nearly missed a doctor's appointment, that I couldn't always recall whether I'd taken my pills. Once, in the front room to nobody, I said that some days it all felt like a lot to manage on my own. And every time I did it, I drove over to Earl's afterward and we wrote it down. The date, the time, my exact words, the fact that it was theater. Earl showed me how to keep a clean log in more than one place. He told me that courts and banks still respect a thing written by hand and dated, that paper outlasts an old man's word in a room full of younger people, and that the trick to surviving people who want to call you incompetent is to be the most carefully documented person in the building. The responses came just the way I'd expected. Shauna texting more often, gentle, just checking in, Lloyd. She brought over a roast on a Thursday she hadn't been asked to bring, and sat watching me eat it. She asked, very casually, whether I'd ever given thought to having someone help manage the financial side, whether it ever got to be too much, whether I worried about keeping up the house. Her tone was so soft you could have mistaken it for love, and I think that's the part that'll stay with me longest, how close the counterfeit can come to the real thing. Then Brian came home for his 2 weeks off, and it broke my heart a little, because my son had no idea. None. I watched him at my table, eating that same roast and laughing at something the boy said, and I understood that whatever his wife was doing, she was doing it around him as much as around me. He'd been told, I'm sure, the same gentle story everyone tells. Dad's slipping, Dad's not safe alone, we have to think about the future. And he believed it because it came from the person he loved and trusted, the same way I'd have believed it. I almost told him 100 times those 2 weeks. I didn't. Reg had said the wrong word in the wrong ear could blow the whole thing, and a son's first instinct would be to confront his wife, and then they'd dismantle the device and bury the paper, and I'd have nothing but a story nobody would believe. So I let my own boy sit there in the dark with me, and I have not entirely forgiven myself for it, even though I'd do it the same way again. There came a Sunday supper at their place. The kids went to bed, and Shauna brought out decaf, and Brian sat forward with his elbows on his knees the way a man sits when he's been coached on what to say. And I realized this was the night. He talked about how much they loved me, about how hard it had been to watch me struggle. His word struggle, since Mom. About how Helen would want them to take care of me. He let her name sit in the room a second, the way people do when they're using a dead woman as a lever and calling it devotion. And then Shauna slid a folder across the coffee table. A new one. Cleaner than the one in the box, partly filled in already. My name at the top, hers listed as attorney for property. Just a power of attorney, she said. Just so things are easier. Just in case. I looked at Brian, and Brian was looking at me with such open, worried love that I nearly went to pieces, because he believed every bit of it. And I looked at Shauna, and Shauna was watching the folder, not me. I picked it up. I turned the pages slow. I told them I'd want a little time to read it over properly. Shauna said, of course, take all the time you need. And she was relaxed when she said it. Easy. Certain. Because in her mind it was already done. I drove home that night and phoned Detective Becker and told her about the folder, and she said quietly, that's what we needed. Now I'll tell you where I nearly ruined it, because I promised myself I'd tell this straight. A few days after that supper I got impatient. I phoned Shauna, and I asked her, plain, whether she'd kept the administrator access on the monitoring system when she set it up. There was a pause, just a hair too long, and she said sure, to make sure it was working. And I asked whether she'd been checking the audio, and her voice changed, still smooth but pulled tight, and she said she didn't know what I meant. I said never mind and wished her good night. The second I set the phone down, I knew I'd moved too soon. Earl had warned me about exactly that, the itch you get once you know the truth and aren't allowed to use it yet. That itch is where people lose everything. I sat in my dark kitchen most of that night thinking about all the ways I'd just handed it back to them. For 4 days. Nothing. Silence, which is its own kind of noise. Then an email landed from Shauna, copying Brian. The subject line was planned for Dad. She wrote warmly about wanting to sit down, all of us, to talk about the road ahead. She mentioned the financial advisor she'd spoken with who specialized in seniors. She attached a list of questions she said would help them help me. And near the bottom, almost in passing, she wrote that she'd had a word with a lawyer who felt the process would go smoother if we all got ahead of it together. I forwarded the whole thing to Reg and to Detective Becker inside the hour. Reg phoned back and said 2 words. That's enough. They set the meeting for the following Tuesday at Reg's office downtown, presented to Brian and Shauna as a routine sit-down about my estate planning. Reg was careful with the wording. Shauna accepted within the hour, which told me everything about how sure of herself she was. I'd thought walking in that morning that my hands would shake. They didn't. There was fresh snow coming down past the office windows, the big slow flakes that mean it's warming up, and I felt the strange flat calm I used to feel on the floor of the mill when a machine was down, and the problem was finally named and all that was left was the work. Rage Boardroom had good light and a long table. Brian came in first and hugged me hard and held on a second too long. Shauna came in behind him, weather folder under her arm, composed, ready. And then Detective Sergeant Becker stood up from the end of the table and introduced herself. and I watched the word she used, case, land in Shauna's face and change something behind her eyes, just for a flicker before she smoothed it back over. Greg started slow with the formalities. Then he laid a printed report on the table in front of Shauna and said evenly that the monitoring system I'd receive as a Christmas gift had been examined by an independent technician and by the police service's own people. He said the device had been altered before it was ever installed in my home to capture and transmit the sound inside my house, far beyond what such a thing is supposed to do, to an account that traced back to Shauna's own work email. Shauna said that wasn't right. Greg slid a second page across, the independent verification and the confirmation from the police. Brian had gone very still, looking from the paper to his wife and back. Greg said, "We also have the folder." And there it was on the table, the one from the box in the spare room. Photocopied, the yellow pad notes about my pills, and the old branch and Helen sitting right on top. Shauna said those were just notes, that she'd been keeping track because she was worried. And Detective Becker leaned in and said, "You were keeping track of behaviors to support a capacity application you'd already had drawn up." And she named the office that had drafted it. She'd done the work. Shauna held her composure better than I'd have guessed, talking about concern and family, and only ever trying to protect her kid's grandfather. But her eyes kept going to Brian, and Brian wasn't giving her what she needed. He was just looking at her like the floor had gone out from under him. Brian said her name once. Just Shauna. Quiet. And then Reg said, "There's an email." And he read out the one line from her note to the senior planning lawyer that mattered, and I won't put it back together word for word, but the meaning of it was as plain as a slap. That the faster they could get me declared incapable, the cleaner it would be to move my assets over. The room held that sentence in the air. Brian put his hand flat on the table, like a man steadying himself on a boat. And Shona stood up and said it was a setup, that I'd manipulated her, that she'd watched me decline for 2 years, that I was a proud, stubborn old fool who didn't know how to ask for help, and that Helen would have wanted her grandchildren protected. I looked at her when she said Helen's name. I didn't say anything for a moment. And then I told her that Helen and I built what we built across 31 years of shift work and double shifts and going without, and that Helen would have wanted it to stay precisely where the two of us put it. Shauna sat back down. There was no arrest in that room. It's not the way it goes. Detective Becker said they'd be in contact with Shauna's lawyer about the device and about statements that had been made to financial institutions during all of this. And she said it the way she said everything, plain, without any meanness in it, just clear. Shauna left with Brian, who looked like a man who'd walked into a glass door he never saw. I stayed behind a few minutes with Reg. He asked if I was all right, and I told him I was. And for the most part, it was even true. When I walked out to the parking lot, the snow had stopped and the sun had broken through the way it does up here on the coldest bright afternoons, hard and white off every surface. I stood by my truck and looked down the street at the lake at the bottom of it, and I thought about Shauna kneeling in my front hall with a drill, mounting a camera, telling me Brian would sleep better. 45 minutes, cheerful the whole time, and I said out loud to nobody that she could have just knit me a pair of socks. Then I scraped the windshield and drove home. Brian came by 3 days later, alone, and he sat at my kitchen table, and he wept in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. He had known. I believed him then, and I believe him now. He'd been told his father was failing by the person closest to him in the world, and he believed it the same as I'd have believed it about him. They're separated now. It's a hard, slow thing, and there are 2 kids in the middle of it, and I won't pretend any of that is tidy. He's home from the mine more often. We're rebuilding something, him and me, plank by plank. Some repairs you can't rush, no matter how badly you want the thing whole again. I changed every password I own within a week. I work with redo my power of attorney and name a trustee who's no relation to anybody, and to put guards around the accounts that I should have had in place years back, in the days when I still believed that being family was the same as being safe. I learned late and the hard way how much of a decent person's life runs on the simple assumption that the people closest to them mean well, and that the assumption itself, that soft, good faith trust, is the exact spot where the worst of it gets in. Earl came for supper a while after, and we ate at the table, which felt right for the first time in 3 years. He said, "You know the cruelest part of the whole business?" I asked him what. He said, "You had to turn yourself into a frightened, failing old man for a month just to prove you weren't one." I've turned that over a lot of nights since. He's right, and there's a cost to it that doesn't show on the outside. You feel it in the quiet. I still catch myself walking past the spare room, thinking about standing in there with that folder in my hands, watching the whole shape of a family rearrange itself in the time it takes to read a column of numbers on a yellow pad. The hub is gone. I don't keep anything in this house that talks to the internet anymore. And I know that sounds extreme to younger people, and I've made my peace with sounding extreme. I've got good deadbolts. A dog 2 doors down that loses its mind at a falling leaf, and 34 years of knowing exactly how a system fails before it fails. That's plenty for me. Some things you can't unlearn once you've learned them. Here's what I'll leave you with, because after all that, you're owed the plain version. At 67, I'd have told you the dangerous years were behind me, that I'd already taken the worst loss a man takes, that what was left was just keeping the furnace going and showing up for the grandkids. What I found out is that the dangerous years don't end. They just put on a winter coat and bring you a present and tell you they're only worried about you. The ones who want what you've built don't always come at you head on. Sometimes they come straight through the people you'd trust with your life. Sometimes they come wrapped up as kindness, as a gift, as worry over an old man who slipped on the ice. If somebody in your life starts paying close attention to your routines, your money, your health, your memory, not the way people who love you pay attention, but the way people building a case pay attention. Believe that feeling. Write it down with the date. Get a second set of eyes from somebody who owes the other party nothing. And see a lawyer before you ever sit across a table from the people doing the asking. Not because everyone is a Sean. Most people aren't, but the few who are will use your good faith against you faster than you can possibly recover. And the paperwork always moves quicker than you'd think. Your home, your name, your savings, your right to make your own choices in your own kitchen. Those are worth the trouble of protecting. And don't let anybody tell you that protecting them means you've stopped loving your family. Real care has never once needed your signature. It doesn't need a password, and it sure as anything doesn't need a little green light blinking in your hallway, listening to you breathe while you sleep. Look after yourselves out there. Check on the old fellow down the street. And if a piece of this sounded like your own life, don't sit on it alone. These things only live in the quiet, and they don't survive being said out loud. The thing I keep coming back to on the quiet nights is that none of it would have worked if I'd been a little less trusting or a little more watchful. And I've had to make my peace with both halves of that. Shauna got as far as she did because I handed her the run of my house and my paperwork without a second thought, and I did that because she'd earned it, sitting with me when Helen's side of the bed was still cold. That's the hard arithmetic of it, the same open door that let a good person in, let the wrong intention in too, and there's no lock that tells the difference. What saved me wasn't suspicion. It was that when Earl told me something was off, I didn't argue with the messenger just because the message frightened me. I went and looked. I've thought a fair bit since about what a man actually needs to come through a thing like this, and it isn't cleverness on its own. Cleverness without a spine just talks itself into doing nothing. What got me across the ice was 3 things working together, and I'd want anybody listening to build all 3, not just the one that comes easy to them. The first is knowing right from wrong clearly enough that you don't let a lie about your own mind go unchallenged just because challenging it is uncomfortable. When Shauna wrote that I was confused for grieving my own wife, something in me knew that was a wrong I couldn't sign my name under, and that knowing was the floor everything else stood on. The second is the plain good sense to slow down and check before you act. To get a second set of eyes from somebody who owes the other side nothing, the way Earl owed Shauna nothing, the way Reg and Detective Becker owed her nothing. I nearly lost the whole thing the night I got impatient and phoned her, and that taught me that being right isn't the same as being ready. You hold the truth quiet until the paper's in order. That's not weakness. That's the difference between feeling vindicated and actually being safe. And the third is the sheer stubbornness to do the unpleasant work day after day, when every part of you wants to throw the door open and shout, standing in my own hall, playing a frightened old fool in front of a camera I hated, then driving to Earl's to write it all down by hand. That cost me something. But a working life taught me that the jobs that matter are mostly the ones you don't feel like doing. I'm not bitter about it, or I'm trying not to be. Brian and I are rebuilding, slow, plank by plank. The grandkids still run at me like one word, Grandpa Lloyd. What I'd leave you with is only this. Keep your heart open, because a closed one isn't worth protecting, but keep your eyes open, the same width. Learn the people who'll tell you the truth, and find it in yourself to do the hard, quiet thing, when the hard, quiet thing is what's called for. Those three together are what kept my name, my own.